While some may view war through a romantic lens, it remains one of humanity's darkest chapters. The destruction of fellow human beings goes against both moral values and, to some extent, even our natural instincts. Yet, war has always been intertwined with civilization, with weapons playing a crucial role in shaping nations, conquering lands, and securing power. You can admire or detest Lenin, but his statement that the state is an apparatus of violence in the hands of the ruling class, or simply put, the elite, reflects a certain reality. At the very least, during the dawn of civilization and the emergence of the first states in the Bronze Age, we see the arrival of the first example of professional weaponry, the sword. While a spear or a bow can be seen not just as weapons but also as hunting tools, and an axe can be viewed as a labor instrument, a sword is, so to speak, the purest form of weaponry. However, these days most people have a vague understanding of bladed weapons, mixed with some misconceptions that we'll dive into today. To talk about swords, we first need to understand what exactly a sword is. In fact, there's a pretty straightforward definition. A sword is a weapon with a straight double-edged blade, suitable for both slashing and stabbing, with its center of gravity shifted closer to the guard. However, it's important to understand one key point. Translating the word sword into other languages often means searching for the closest, though not always identical, term. For instance, according to current standards, a Japanese katana is classified as a saber, but in the East, it's referred to by a word that translates to sword in Russian. The thing is that the Japanese don't have a direct word for sword in Russian, and their equivalent carries a slightly different idea. In general, not everything called a sword is actually one. On the flip side, the concept behind this word in various languages differs a bit, making it tough to pin everything down to one strict, universally correct definition. A lot of misconceptions about swords stem from viewing the past as a single moment. When discussing the popularity of swords, some articles claim that this weapon was incredibly rare and expensive, while others say it was widely available. It's important to understand that, for example, Rome had a massive professional army that peaked at around 600,000 soldiers. They produced weapons on an industrial scale, resulting in a huge number of those short swords known as gladi. However, after the fall of Rome and the disappearance of the professional army as a phenomenon, swords became quite rare in the early Middle Ages. This weapon was a symbol of high status. Later on, toward the end of the High Middle Ages, with advancements in metallurgy and the rise of towns, longer bladed weapons became more accessible and widespread. But it's important to note that, for instance, in the 13th and 14th centuries in England, the cost of a somewhat poorly made sword, possibly made from something vaguely resembling steel, started at around 7 pence. But a really good sword could cost up to 2,000 pence. In short, a quality sword has always been expensive. In movies, you often see large groups of infantry armed with swords. However, for most of the Middle Ages, swords, except for a few cases, were primarily weapons of feudal lords, meaning those who owned their own land and were mounted knights. And yes, they weren't the most common type of weapon. Spears, axes, and maces were much more prevalent. A knight might not have a sword, but he was unthinkable without a spear. It's also worth noting that there were no specific Russian swords. In Russia, they used the same types of weapons as the rest of Europe. These types trace their roots back to Celtic weaponry. There are quite a few misconceptions about the weight of swords, and there's a dedicated video on this topic on the channel. In short, long single-handed swords typically weighed less than 1.5 kilograms. Two-handed swords weighed around 3, and in some cases, up to 4 kilograms. The speed of delivering slashing and especially thrusting attacks was crucial for a sword. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how powerful your sword strikes are if your opponent has already stabbed you with their weapon. Again, if you can swing something weighing 10 kilograms or more quickly, like a barbell's grip, you don't really need any blade or point to make it effective. It would knock down and crush enemies, regardless of how strong their armor was. By the way, to lighten the sword while maintaining the blade's strength, a special groove with ribs, known as a fuller, was created, sometimes mistakenly called a blood groove. This fuller also reduced the chances of the blade getting stuck, which is quite important. One of the most commonly perpetuated misconceptions about swords is their ability to pierce armor. In reality, even cutting through a decent chainmail and causing any harm to its wearer is quite difficult. A long sword essentially couldn't handle a good set of full-plate armor at all. More often than not, opponents in any kind of armor were stabbed rather than slashed. However, against plate armor, different types of weaponry were usually employed. The evolution of the longsword throughout the Middle Ages was essentially a shift from being primarily a slashing weapon to being mainly a thrusting one. There are many misconceptions directly related to fencing as well. These misconceptions stem from modern theatrical fencing often seen in various films. The phrase "cross swords" is a recent invention. In the Middle Ages, no one would risk taking a blow from a sword's edge unless absolutely necessary, and they certainly didn't try to strike their opponent's blade. While these moves look impressive, it's actually much easier to damage or even break an expensive sword than many people think. Keep in mind that the blade's thickness usually doesn't exceed 5 to 6 millimeters, with a length of 70 to 80 centimeters. When a sword strikes another blade or armor, it undergoes immense stress. Hard steel holds an edge well but is quite brittle. On the other hand, a blade made from softer steel will dull quickly, become unusable, and might even bend. Since a significant portion of the sword's weight is concentrated in the hilt, the crushing force upon impact was minimal. This is why a sword that has lost its edge is largely ineffective. Despite some claims online that swords weren't sharpened and functioned like axes, that's simply not true. The blade was indeed sharpened, but it's important to note that we're not talking about razor-sharp edges. You could handle the blade without fear of cutting yourself. After all, it was primarily a slashing and thrusting weapon, not a cutting one. A good edge could perform wonderfully against softer materials. However, contact with anything reasonably hard would quickly ruin a well-sharpened blade. In fact, sometimes against an armored opponent, fighters would grab the sword by the blade to deliver blows, effectively turning it into an improvised hammer. Wearing gloves allowed fighters to catch the blade of a distracted opponent. Interestingly, in theatrical fencing, they use swords made from relatively soft metal and without sharpening. Even a single chip on a blade from a real fight could significantly impact the owner's wallet. That's why shields were primarily used to deflect blows. As for two-handed swords, the lower part of the blade was unsharpened. This section was known as the strong side, and fighters aimed to receive their opponent's blade on it. If you watch professional reenactors' battles, you'll usually notice that they don't perform dramatic blade-on-blade strikes, even considering that thrusting attacks are prohibited in reenactments. In the Middle Ages, however, a significant portion of strikes made with swords were thrusts. Someone might recall that when blocking with a sword, it should be angled so that the opponent's blade slides off. However, as they say, that approach might work sometimes, but not always. Much depends on the force of the strike, the angle at which it's delivered, and other factors. In any case, the collision of two blades carries the risk of losing or damaging what is usually an expensive weapon. According to British fencing master Richard Ryan, in the Middle Ages, it was common practice to deflect an opponent's sword not with the edge, but with the flat of the blade. This way, the principle of elastic deformation of the blade comes into play, which doesn't happen when striking across the edge. Interestingly, in movies, the hero sometimes makes a strike while spinning 360 degrees. While this looks impressive, in real combat, it's not seconds but fractions of a second that matter, and such dramatic movements can end poorly. Additionally, in films, the main character often wields two swords, but this style of fighting wasn't used in the Middle Ages. In a serious battle with a high density of fighters per square meter, even one long sword isn't the most practical weapon, let alone two. The combination of a shield and a sword is much more practical and effective. Two-handed weapons offer greater striking distance and deliver more powerful blows than using two weapons. Again, let's remember that blocking strikes with the edge of a blade isn't the best idea. However, a fighter wielding two swords does look impressive, which is why in Rome, there were gladiators who fought with a weapon in each hand, known as dimachiri, although they were typically armed with short swords or daggers. In modern times, a dagger was sometimes used in the other hand alongside a rapier. Swords, as we know, were carried in sheaths, which served the important function of protecting the blade from moisture and other environmental damage. These sheaths were mainly made of wood and often covered in leather. When drawing a sword from its sheath, there was no screeching sound. The sheaths could be attached to a belt or a horse's saddle, while two-handed swords were often simply carried on the shoulder. The sheaths often seen in movies and books worn on the owner's back were not common. To sum up this video, the sword is undoubtedly a versatile weapon and in a sense a symbol of the Middle Ages. However, the current popularity of swords in popular culture is primarily driven by the film industry and certain authors. Unfortunately, many of these popularizers have a rather superficial understanding of this weapon.